Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I had never been a believer in ghosts or spirits. The supernatural, to me, was nothing more than folklore, a collection of old wives' tales meant to scare children or entertain the gullible. But that was before I found the Hollow. It was a cold October evening when I first stumbled upon the place. I had been driving through the countryside, seeking solitude after the end of a long, drawn-out relationship. The quiet, winding roads were a balm to my frayed nerves, and the sight of the autumn leaves, their vibrant colors bleeding into the sunset, was almost enough to make me forget the pain. The sign was easy to miss, half hidden by overgrown ivy. Grimsby Hollow, Pop. 42. The name intrigued me. There was something almost poetic about it, and in my fragile state, I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I turned onto the narrow gravel path, the tires crunching softly beneath me. Grimsby Hollow was nestled deep within the woods, a small village that time seemed to have forgotten. The houses were old, their wooden frames weathered and worn, yet they stood with a quiet dignity, as if guarding secrets of a time long past. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and a thick mist clung to the ground, swirling around my feet as I stepped out of the car. I hadn't planned to stop, but something about the hollow made me want to linger. The silence was almost tangible, pressing down on me, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the fading light. It was eerie, but also oddly comforting. A place where I could disappear, where the world and its troubles couldn't reach me. I found an inn at the center of the village, its sign swinging gently in the breeze. The Hollow's Rest. It was an old building, the wood creaking under the weight of years, but it had a certain charm. The innkeeper, a wiry old man with a face like cracked leather, greeted me with a nod, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Passing through?" he asked, his voice raspy from years of smoke or drink. "Just for the night," I replied, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true. The Hollow had a way of pulling you in, making you feel like you were meant to stay. He handed me a key, its brass surface worn smooth. "Room at the top of the stairs, last one on the left." I thanked him and made my way up the narrow staircase, the wood groaning under my weight. The hallway was dimly lit, the air musty, and the floorboards creaked with every step. My room was small, sparsely furnished, but clean. A single window overlooked the village square, now shrouded in darkness. As I unpacked my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was too deep, too absolute. It was as if the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I brushed off the unease and decided to explore. The village was quiet, the streets empty. The few people I did see moved quickly, their eyes downcast, as if they were trying to avoid notice. There were no sounds of life, no dogs barking, no children playing, just the wind whispering through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. I found myself at the edge of the village, where the trees grew thicker, their branches twisted and gnarled. A narrow path wound its way into the woods, and despite the growing darkness, I felt compelled to follow it. The further I went, the more the world seemed to fade away. The trees closed in around me, blocking out the moonlight, and the air grew colder, heavier. I should have turned back, but something urged me forward, a whisper at the back of my mind. The path led to a clearing, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its branches bare and twisted like the claws of some ancient beast. The ground around it was barren, the earth scarred as if it had been burned. I stood there, transfixed as the wind picked up, whipping through the clearing, and then I heard it. A voice, soft, almost a whisper, calling my name. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice came again, closer this time, echoing through the trees. My heart raced, and I backed away, but the voice followed, insistent, pulling me towards the tree. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, the voice echoing in my ears. It was only when the wind died down and the voice faded that I snapped out of my trance. I stumbled back along the path, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind racing. By the time I reached the inn, the village was completely dark, the mist thickening around the buildings. I slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The innkeeper was gone, the front desk deserted. The place felt abandoned, as if I were the only one left. I hurried up the stairs to my room, locking the door behind me. My heart was still pounding, my mind replaying the events in the clearing. The voice had been so real, so clear. But there had been no one there, just the tree, ancient and foreboding. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind sent a jolt of fear through me. The silence of the village was oppressive, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to move, shifting in the corners of the room. The next morning, the village was unchanged, silent, shrouded in mist, and empty of life. I felt a strange sense of dread as I left the inn, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind. I needed to leave, to get away from this place, but something held me back, a force stronger than fear. I found myself drawn back to the clearing, unable to resist its pull. The path seemed different in the daylight, less sinister, more ordinary, but the sense of unease remained. The oak tree was still there, standing like a sentinel, its twisted branches reaching towards the sky. I stood at the edge of the clearing, reluctant to go closer. The voice was gone, but the silence was just as unnerving. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the very ground was holding its breath. And then, I saw it. A figure standing at the base of the tree, half hidden in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped forward, squinting to see more clearly. The figure was tall, its outline blurred, as if it were part of the mist. I called out, but there was no response. The figure remained still, unmoving, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if the very air around it was wrong, twisted. I took another step forward, and the figure moved. It turned slowly, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. And then it was gone, dissolving into the mist, leaving me alone in the clearing. I ran back to the village, my mind racing. What had I seen? A trick of the light? A shadow? But deep down, I knew it was something more. Something that didn't belong in this world. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I wandered the village, but there was no escape from the oppressive silence, the heavy sense of something watching. The few villagers I encountered were distant, their eyes hollow, their faces drawn. They avoided my gaze, their movements quick and furtive. As night fell, I returned to the inn, my nerves frayed. The innkeeper was back at his post, but he said nothing as I passed by, his eyes following me with a look of knowing. I locked myself in my room, but sleep was a distant dream. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. And then, just as the night deepened, I heard it again, the voice soft and insistent, calling my name. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice grew louder, closer, until it was all I could hear. It wasn't just one voice now. It was many, a chorus of whispers, echoing through the walls, the floor, the very air. The voices grew frantic, pleading, their words jumbled and incoherent. But the one thing I understood clearly was the desperation, the fear. They were calling for help, begging for release. I curled up in bed, trembling, as the voices filled the room, surrounding me, closing in. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in their wake. I stayed awake until dawn, afraid to close my eyes, afraid of what might happen if I did. The sun brought little relief, the light weak and filtered through the mist. The village was unchanged, silent and empty, but the sense of dread was stronger than ever. I had to leave. Whatever was happening in Grimsby Hollow, it wasn't natural. I packed my things quickly, eager to put distance between myself and the village. But as I made my way to the car, I found the road out blocked by fallen trees, their massive trunks crisscrossing the path. It was impossible. The trees were old, their roots deep, and there had been no storm to bring them down. It was as if something, or someone, had placed them there deliberately, trapping me in the hollow. Frustration and fear warred within me as I turned back towards the village. There had to be another way out, a different road, a path through the woods. But no matter where I went, I ended up back in the village, as if the very ground was conspiring to keep me there. I was exhausted, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion, when I stumbled upon an old church at the edge of the village. It was a small, weathered building, its steeple leaning to one side, but something about it drew me in. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the pews coated in a fine layer of grime. It looked like no one had set foot in the place for years. At the front of the church, a large wooden cross hung on the wall, its surface cracked and worn. Beneath it, the altar was covered in old, yellowed papers, scattered haphazardly, as if someone had been searching through them in a hurry. Curiosity piqued, I approached the altar, sifting through the papers. Most of them were old records, births, deaths, marriages. But one document stood out, its edges frayed, the ink faded. It was a journal, written in a shaky hand, the pages filled with frantic, desperate entries. As I read, a chill settled over me. The journal belonged to the village priest, who had documented the strange occurrences in Grimsby Hollow. Voices in the night, shadows that moved on their own, people disappearing without a trace. The entries grew more frantic, the priest's fear palpable. He wrote of a curse, an ancient evil that had taken root in the hollow, feeding on the souls of those who entered. The village was trapped, its people doomed to suffer for eternity, their spirits bound to the hollow. The last entry was a warning. Leave this place. Do not let it take you. The hollow is alive, and it will consume you if you stay. I dropped the journal, my hands trembling. Everything made sense now, the voices, the shadows, the oppressive silence. The hollow was cursed, its evil seeping into the very ground, the very air. I had to get out, but the village was a maze, the roads leading nowhere, the trees blocking every path. I was trapped, just like the others. As I fled the church, the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness closing in once more. The mist thickened, swirling around me, and the voices returned, louder and more insistent than before. I ran through the village, but there was no escape. The shadows lengthened, reaching out with clawed hands, and the voices rose to a deafening chorus, their words twisting in my mind. The last thing I remember is falling, the ground giving way beneath me, the darkness swallowing me whole. I woke up in the clearing, the twisted oak tree towering above me, its branches reaching for the sky. The mist was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, my limbs heavy. The ground beneath me was cold, hard, and I realized with a jolt of fear that I wasn't lying on the earth. I was lying on stone. The clearing was gone, replaced by the inside of an old crypt. The walls were made of stone, cold and damp, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Panic set in as I struggled to free myself, but the stone slab beneath me held me in place as if it were a part of me. The voices were gone, but the silence was worse, an oppressive weight that pressed down on me, crushing the breath from my lungs. And then I heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like nails on stone. It was coming from the walls, the sound growing louder, closer, until it was all I could hear. Something was moving in the shadows, something that didn't belong in this world. I could feel its presence, cold and malevolent as it crept closer, its breath hot on my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing in the shadows was close now, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its twisted form just out of sight. And then it was on me, its hands cold and clammy, its breath rancid. It whispered in my ear, its voice a twisted parody of humanity. And I knew then that there was no escape. The hollow had claimed me, just as it had claimed the others. My soul was bound to this place, trapped for eternity in the darkness, the silence, the fear. And so, I wait, listening to the whispers, feeling the cold, clammy hands of the thing in the shadows. I am part of the hollow now, another lost soul in a place where the darkness never ends, where the silence is a living thing, and where the shadows hold secrets that should never be known. And I know that one day, someone else will stumble upon this place, drawn in by its eerie charm, its quiet solitude. They too will hear the voices, see the shadows, feel the cold breath of the thing in the darkness. And they too will become part of the hollow, another echo in the endless night. It started on a night like any other, the kind of night where the world feels perfectly normal. The air was cool, the stars blinked lazily above, and the trees outside my window rustled gently in the breeze. I had just settled into bed, ready to drift off into a dreamless sleep when I heard it, the whisper. It wasn't loud, more like the softest breath of wind against my ear, but it was unmistakable. "They will pay." I bolted upright, heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty. Just the usual shadows cast by my desk lamp, the clutter of clothes on the floor, and the half-open closet door. But something felt off. For a moment I considered shrugging it off as my imagination, but the unease gnawed at me. I'd been feeling strange all day, like I was being watched. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling, and forced myself to lie back down. But sleep was elusive. The whisper haunted me. The next day, I couldn't shake the sense of dread. The whisper had been so real, so close. I convinced myself it was just the remnants of a dream, but the anxiety gnawed at my nerves. I needed to get out of the house. I decided to visit my grandmother. She lived in an old Victorian house at the edge of town, a place that always felt like a safe haven. As a child, I spent countless hours there, exploring the attic, listening to her stories, and feeling secure within the walls that had stood for over a century. The house was the only thing that connected me to my family's past. My parents had died in a car accident when I was young, leaving me in my grandmother's care. She never spoke much about our family history, and I never asked until now. I arrived at her house in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. The house looked the same as always, a little weathered but still standing tall, with ivy creeping up its stone walls. My grandmother was in the garden tending to her roses. "Granny," I called as I approached, forcing a smile. "How are the roses doing?" She looked up, her face lighting up with a warm smile. "Oh, they're coming along just fine, dear. How are you? You look pale." "I'm fine, just had a strange night," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "Can we talk inside?" She nodded, concern flashing in her eyes. We walked into the house together, the familiar scent of lavender and old wood welcoming me. I followed her to the living room, where we sat down in front of the large fireplace that dominated the room. "What's troubling you, dear?" she asked, her voice gentle. I hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Last night I heard something. A whisper. It said, 'They will pay.' It sounded so real, like someone was right there in the room with me." My grandmother's face turned pale, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at the flickering flames in the fireplace. "Granny, do you know something?" I pressed, my heart pounding with unease. She sighed, a sound filled with decades of burden. "There's something you need to know about our family. Something I hoped you'd never have to hear." I leaned forward, my anxiety twisting into a knot of fear. "What is it?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a sorrow I had never seen before. "Our family is cursed." The word hit me like a physical blow. "Cursed? What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "It began many generations ago, with your great-great-grandfather, William Ashford. He was a wealthy man, but cruel. He wronged someone, a woman, who was powerful in ways we didn't understand. She was wronged by him and his associates, betrayed in the worst way possible. In her dying breath, she cursed him and all his descendants. She swore that her spirit would return to exact vengeance on those who bore his blood." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "You're saying, this whisper, this thing I heard, it's her?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She's the Wraith. She's been haunting our family for over a century. Every night she returns to torment the descendants of those who wronged her. Some nights it's whispers, other nights it's worse, but it always escalates." My heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I wanted to protect you," she said, tears welling in her eyes. I thought if we didn't speak of it, maybe it wouldn't happen to you. But it seems it's your turn now." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. This couldn't be real. Curses weren't real. But the fear in my grandmother's eyes, the terror that seeped into my bones, it all felt too real to deny. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing you can do," she said, her voice breaking. "We've tried everything, but the Wraith, she's relentless. She won't stop until her vengeance is complete." The weight of her words settled on me like a shroud. I was doomed. There was no escaping it. The Wraith would come for me, just as she had come for those before me. That night I returned home, feeling like I was walking into my own grave. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually claimed me. I didn't want to sleep, didn't want to face whatever might come. But I couldn't fight it. It wasn't long before the whisper returned. "They will pay." This time, it was louder, more insistent. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the air. Shadows twisted and danced on the walls as if mocking me. I wanted to run, to escape, but where could I go? I was trapped in this nightmare. A cold wind swept through the room, and the whisper grew louder. "They will pay." I clutched the blanket around me, fear gripping my heart. "What do you want from me?" I cried, my voice shaking. The whisper turned into a wail, a sound filled with centuries of anguish and rage. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and the shadows on the walls began to take shape, forming the outline of a figure. A woman, her face twisted in fury. "You are one of them," she hissed, her voice echoing around the room. "You will pay for their sins." "No!" I screamed, backing away. "I didn't do anything. It wasn't me." But the Wraith didn't care. She moved closer, her form solidifying with every step. Her eyes burned with hatred, her mouth twisted into a snarl. "You bear their blood," she growled, "and you will suffer as they did." I stumbled backward, my legs giving way as I collapsed onto the floor. The Wraith loomed over me, her presence suffocating, her rage a tangible force. I could barely breathe, the air around me thick with her malice. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Please don't do this." But she only laughed, a cruel, cold sound that sent shivers down my spine. "There is no escape," she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You are mine." And then, she was upon me. The world went dark, her icy touch searing through my flesh, and I screamed as the pain engulfed me. It was as if my very soul was being torn apart, piece by piece. I don't know how long it lasted. Seconds, minutes, hours. But when it was over, I was left gasping on the floor, my body trembling with agony. The wraith had gone, but her presence lingered, a dark shadow that clung to my mind. I knew she would return. Tomorrow night, the night after that, and every night until she had her vengeance. There was no escaping it, no end to the torment. The days that followed were a blur of fear and desperation. I tried everything, staying with friends, leaving the house, even sleeping during the day. But it didn't matter. The wraith found me wherever I went, her whispers growing more menacing, her visits more painful. I became a shell of my former self, consumed by terror, unable to sleep, unable to eat. I was a prisoner in my own life, haunted by a spirit that wouldn't rest until I was destroyed. And every night she grew stronger. The whispers became screams, the shadows became forms that clawed at my skin, leaving marks that no one else could see. The wraith was relentless, her vengeance unyielding. My grandmother tried to help, but there was nothing she could do. She watched helplessly as I withered away, her heart breaking for the child she couldn't save. But I could see it in her eyes, the knowledge that this was inevitable, that there was no hope. One night, after a particularly brutal attack, I couldn't take it anymore. I was beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. I was done fighting, done running. I was ready to end it. I stood in front of the mirror in my bathroom, looking at the hollow-eyed reflection staring back at me. I didn't recognize myself anymore. The person I had been was gone, replaced by this broken shell tormented by a curse I never asked for. The wraith's voice echoed in my mind, her cruel laughter mingling with the whispers that never ceased. "There is no escape," she had said, and I knew she was right. But maybe there was one way out. I opened the medicine cabinet and stared at the bottles inside, the labels blurring in my vision. Sleep. Eternal, dreamless sleep. The only thing that might offer peace, that might finally free me from her grasp. With trembling hands, I reached for the pills. A handful would do it. A handful to silence the whispers, to end the torment once and for all. But as I held them in my hand, something inside me rebelled. Was this really how it was going to end? Was I really going to let her win? I had no power against the wraith, no way to break the curse, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. There had to be something I could do, some way to fight back, to reclaim my life. I dropped the pills into the sink, the decision to survive burning like a small ember inside me. If I was going to die, it wouldn't be by my own hand. I would face the wraith head-on, no matter what it took. That night, I didn't wait for her to come to me. I went to her. I returned to my grandmother's house, the place where it all began, where the curse had been born. The house was dark and silent, the shadows deepening as I stepped inside. I could feel the wraith's presence immediately, a chill that settled into my bones. She was waiting for me. I made my way to the attic, the one place in the house that had always unnerved me as a child. I had never gone up there, never dared to explore its dusty corners. But now I knew it was the heart of the curse, the place where the wraith's power was strongest. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dark, musty space beyond. I could see her standing in the far corner, her form barely more than a shadow. Her eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and I knew she was ready to strike. But I didn't back down. I stepped into the attic, my heart pounding, my mind racing with fear and determination. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking but firm. The wraith hissed, her voice echoing through the room. "I want justice." "Justice for what?" I cried, the frustration and anger boiling over. "I wasn't the one who wronged you. I wasn't even born then. Why are you punishing me?" She moved closer, her form solidifying, her face becoming more defined. It was a face twisted with rage and pain, a face that had once been beautiful but was now a mask of torment. "They took everything from me," she whispered, her voice filled with a sorrow so deep it cut through me like a knife. "They took my life, my love, my future. And now, I take theirs." I shook my head. tears streaming down my face. "Please, there has to be another way. Let me help you. Let me put this right." Her eyes narrowed, the anger flaring once more. "You cannot undo what was done. You cannot give me back what they took." "I know," I whispered, my voice breaking. "But I can try. Tell me how. Tell me what I can do." For a moment she hesitated, her form flickering like a dying flame. Then she spoke, her voice softer, less certain. "There is one way to end this." I leaned forward, desperate to hear her words. "Tell me, please." She stared at me, her eyes piercing into my soul. "You must find the relic, the one that binds me to this world. It was hidden by your ancestors, buried deep where they thought I could never reach it. Destroy it, and you will free me." The relic. I didn't know what it was or where to find it, but I knew I had to try. It was my only chance, the only hope I had left. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. She pointed to the floor beneath her. "Here, beneath the house, in the earth." I nodded, the resolve hardening in my chest. I would find it. I would dig through the earth itself if I had to. Without wasting another moment, I grabbed a shovel from the garage and returned to the attic. The floorboards creaked as I pried them up, revealing the cold, hard ground beneath. I began to dig, my hands trembling with exhaustion and fear. The wraith watched me, her form hovering above, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. Time seemed to stretch on forever as I dug, the hole growing deeper with every thrust of the shovel. And then, I hit something solid. My heart skipped a beat as I dropped to my knees, brushing the dirt away with my hands. It was a box, old and weathered, the wood rotting from centuries in the ground. I pulled it free, my hands shaking as I opened it. Inside was a small, ornate object, a locket, intricately carved and glimmering faintly in the dim light. I could feel the power emanating from it, the dark energy that bound the wraith to this world. "This is it," I whispered, looking up at her. "This is what holds you here." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the locket. "Destroy it." I hesitated, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. If I destroyed the locket, would it really end the curse? Would it finally set her free? But there was no other choice. I had to believe it would work. With a deep breath, I raised the shovel and brought it down on the locket with all my strength. The sound of shattering metal filled the air, followed by a rush of cold wind that knocked me backward. The wraith screamed, a sound of pure agony and release as her form began to dissolve into the air. The shadows receded, the room brightening as her presence faded. And then she was gone. I lay on the floor panting, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The curse was broken, the wraith was free, I had done it. The days that followed were like waking from a long nightmare. The house felt lighter, the air warmer. The shadows that had haunted me were gone, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. My grandmother cried when I told her what had happened, her tears of sorrow mixed with relief. The curse that had plagued our family for generations was finally over. But the memory of the wraith's vengeance, of her torment, would stay with me forever. She had been wronged, her life stolen from her, and in her pain, she had sought revenge. I could only hope that, in the end, I had given her the peace she had been denied for so long. And as I stood in the attic, looking at the shattered remains of the locket, I whispered a silent prayer for the woman whose wrath had shaped my fate. Rest in peace. Unless something happened that I'm not aware of, this is the first time anyone outside the family has heard this story. It took place on the Navajo reservation in Arizona, where my father's family lived. Some of them still live there, while others, like some of my aunts and uncles, moved out with their own families. We eventually moved to a nearby town, which was also outside the reservation. Why did we move out? Well, if you didn't know, some parts of the Navajo reservation are almost like dry deserts. The home we were staying in during the early 90s, Grandma Ella's house, had no running water, no electricity, and no phone service. Everything was miles away. My grandparents raised sheep and tended to the land, so life was simple back then. As the years passed, droughts became more frequent and crops would dry up. Water pumps stopped working, and sometimes we spent the whole day getting water for ourselves and for the animals from other communities miles away. As my grandparents grew older, they could no longer manage the livestock and hauling water. All of their children, including my dad, took turns hauling water and helping with the livestock. This led to arguments and discussions among the siblings about whose turn it was to get water or take care of the animals. Everything started one day when no one went to get water on an extremely hot day. I don't remember the exact details, but the arguments had reached a point where everyone thought someone else would do it. That day, nobody went, so Grandpa Tom decided to get the water himself. On his way back home, the trailer he was pulling veered off the road and he got into an accident. Unfortunately, he didn't survive. This caused a rift in the family, with siblings pointing fingers and blaming each other for his death. This tragedy created a lot of issues between families for many years. It was hard for all of us. We were incredibly close, and I would even have nightmares about Grandpa dying. It was so bad that I couldn't sleep sometimes. Arguments and fights between family members happened frequently. From my dad's side, everyone pointed fingers at each other, perhaps because they all felt guilty. This caused everyone to drift apart. Some even blamed poor Grandma Ella for not taking sides. Everyone thought they were right, and some felt betrayed when she didn't support them. Eventually, some of my aunts and uncles stopped visiting altogether. Because of this, I barely saw her. From what I know, she spent so much time alone. She refused to visit her children, not because she held anything against them, but because she didn't want anyone to think she was showing favoritism. Instead, she preferred that people visit her if they wanted to spend time with her. She chose to spend weekends and social gatherings by herself. None of her children could find peace knowing their mom was alone. My dad, at least, suffered in silence, and it seemed like he was the closest to Grandma since he communicated with her the most. You know how family arguments go. After years, everyone eventually comes back around as if nothing happened. The lost time and impact can't be recovered, and the memories still linger. I remember it was a Thursday morning, and Christmas was approaching. Although we didn't really celebrate it, people were off work, and that's when we received the phone call. I answered, and it was Grandma Ella. She wanted to talk to my dad. She sounded a bit nervous. When my dad took the phone, he always had the house phone on speaker, because he had trouble hearing through the phone, so I could hear the conversation Grandma was having with him. She mentioned that she felt really sick and was calling all her children because she didn't want to leave without speaking to everyone. She wanted to invite everyone over that weekend, as tomorrow is never promised. Then she said something strange. I could tell Grandma stepped away from the phone because of what she said. "Wait a minute, son. There's something outside." She walked away from the phone, opened the door, and stepped outside. I could hear the wind blowing, and through that sound I heard Grandma's voice shouting and cursing as she tried to chase something away from the house. A few minutes later, Grandma got back on the phone. "Sorry, son, that darn dog is back, but no worries, I took care of it." This was even more strange because I knew Grandma loved every dog. The 4 she had were strays she found abandoned on the street. She was the most affectionate person we knew when it came to dogs. So, it was odd. What dog was that? My dad said it was one of those dogs that had been lurking around the home for days. "But don't worry, I'll stay outside to keep an eye on it in case it comes back. I'll call you back soon." My dad couldn't respond before she hung up. He went out to the car to talk to my mom. They only talked in the car when they argued to keep us from hearing their fights. It worked, but we still worried whenever they did. This time, however, it was different. When they finished, my dad went straight to his room. My mom then came to the phone and made a call. I couldn't tell who she was talking to or what she was discussing because she was quieter than my dad. She hung up and told me we were going to spend the coming weekend with Grandma. I was surprised, but very happy. I saw Grandma less and less each year and felt less connected to her. The idea of spending a weekend with her for the first time in ages filled me with joy. My mom then went into the room with my dad, and they talked for a few minutes. It seemed serious. When she came out, she told me to start packing because they were going to send me with my cousin, Alex, to Grandma's place first thing tomorrow. She explained that Grandma was sick, and it wasn't good for her to be alone. Apparently, they had already talked to my uncles and aunts to find out who all was going, and everyone, including Alex, was going. I asked why we weren't all going, and she explained that work would complicate things. We had a stationery store, and she managed everything during that busy time of year, with lots of gift wrap and Christmas decor sales. Therefore, they were sending me and Alex tomorrow, and the rest of the family would join on Saturday morning. The next morning, we had everything ready. None of us had ever gone to Grandma's house by public transport, but we managed to find the place without much trouble. The street was just as we remembered, and it felt like time hadn't passed. I can't explain how happy I was to see Grandma again, not just in passing or at a funeral. We hugged, she cooked for us, and she told us stories. It was like before, back to simpler times, when the only worries were about the sheep and the land. That evening, we all sat down for dinner, sharing a meal that Grandma had cooked. The table was filled with traditional Navajo dishes, and as we ate, the room was filled with jokes and memories of when we were younger. It felt like we were all together again, and that was all that mattered. Soon it got dark, and the wind started blowing fiercely. We were all sitting around the table when the dog started barking, but it wasn't the usual bark of a dog. It was the kind of bark that means something is nearby. If you have dogs, you know exactly what I mean. This bark sounded like something was around. That's when Alex peeked out the window and stayed quiet for a few seconds before coming back to us. He looked pale, almost like he had seen a ghost. "There's a dog trying to get in through the back garden door," he said. Grandma had a small garden in the back of her home, which is why there was a door leading to that area. Alex then said, "There's a dog standing out in the distance." Grandma grabbed a machete and walked toward the door. She told us to stay inside and not come out no matter what we heard. "This isn't a normal dog," she said. "It's something else. It's been coming around here for a few days, and I've tried to scare it off, but it just keeps coming back. I see it in its eyes and know it's not here for food. It's here for something else, something it wants from me. I need to show it that it's not welcome here." She opened the door and struck it twice to scare the dog away, but it didn't seem to be scared. She started walking toward it, and as soon as Grandma took a few steps, the dog looked at her, then at us, and calmly turned to walk towards the hills as if nothing happened. Grandma kept shouting curses at it, but the way the dog looked at us was hard to explain. It felt evil, like it didn't care about anything. We slowly retreated back into the house. The night closed in around us. Grandma's expression was one of deep concern, but she tried to reassure us that we would be fine, even though her eyes said otherwise. "Hey, Grandma," I said, "that's not a dog. It has to be something else. How is it that it's been around for days, and you haven't called the police or Dad to come and help you?" Grandma was silent for a moment. "There's nothing for the police to do. It's not a normal dog. They wouldn't be able to help anyway." Soon after that, my mom, Dad, and the rest of the family arrived. Everyone was worried because of the way Grandma looked. We had to tell them what happened and how Grandma had been on edge all night, not sleeping a wink. My aunts and uncles joined us. We were all together for the first time in years. My mom, Dad, and everyone agreed to stay the night with Grandma, and Grandma seemed a lot calmer. The whole family stayed that night and continued staying there for a few days. It was like a reunion. Grandma was always smiling, and it was like the old times. Alex and I stayed in Grandma's room that night. Everything was great, but later Grandma's eyes grew dark again, and she told us to sleep. The next day, everything was back to normal, and we forgot about the strange events. Grandma's health improved, and everything seemed to be okay. We didn't talk much about the dog or the strange things that happened. It seemed like it never existed. To this day, nobody knows what that thing really was. All we know is that it was nothing like a normal dog. It didn't have the appearance of one, and its presence had a certain dark energy. Grandma never spoke of it again, and the family remained close-knit for a while before going back to our busy lives. We eventually stopped visiting as frequently, but Grandma always kept in touch through letters and calls. Every year, we would still get a card or letter from her, and she would always say she hoped to see us soon. It's been years since that night. Grandma passed away peacefully a few years later. We still think about her often, and we often reminisce about the reunion and the strange incident with the dog. Even though we don't talk about it much, that night remains a memory that we can't quite forget. My name is Claire, and I've always been drawn to antiques. Their faded elegance and the secrets they seem to hold captivate me. On a rainy October afternoon, I stumbled across an old, dusty antique shop nestled between towering buildings in a forgotten part of town. The shop was a labyrinth of relics, each piece whispering stories of the past. But one item seized my attention almost immediately, a large, ornate mirror with an intricately carved frame. The metalwork was dark and brooding, adorned with twisted vines and leaves that seemed to writhe and move if you stared at them long enough. The glass was exceptionally clear, almost unnervingly so, and it seemed to absorb the dim light in the room, casting an eerie glow. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with deeply lined features, observed me with a wary expression as I approached the mirror. He looked as if he were about to speak, but hesitated. "This mirror," he finally said, "is not just an ordinary antique. It has a reputation for showing more than what's there. Are you sure you want to take it home?" I laughed off his ominous warning, dismissing it as a sales tactic to make the mirror seem more mysterious. "I appreciate the heads up, but I'm not superstitious," I replied, trying to sound light-hearted. The old man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he wrapped the mirror carefully and handed it to me. As I left the shop, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The way he looked at me, almost pityingly, lingered in my mind like a dark cloud. I placed the mirror in my bedroom, directly across from my bed. It was a perfect fit, completing the room's antique aesthetic. That night, I admired how the mirror captured the moonlight, casting a gentle, silvery hue across the room. As I lay in bed, staring at the mirror, I felt an uneasy chill. I glanced at it casually, but what I saw made my heart skip a beat. My reflection seemed slightly off. My face was pale and stricken with terror, eyes wide, and mouth open in a silent scream. It was so vivid that I had to look behind me to check if something was there. But my room was empty, save for the shadows cast by the dim moonlight. The next night, the image was even more disturbing. As I prepared for bed, I looked into the mirror and saw myself sitting on the edge of the bed, clutching the sheets, my face contorted with fear. Behind me, barely visible, was a dark, indistinct shape. It seemed to be creeping closer with each passing moment. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But the unsettling feeling lingered. Each time I looked into the mirror, the reflections grew darker and more distressing. The shadowy figure seemed to loom closer, its form becoming more defined, though still indistinct. The fear that gripped me was relentless. I started avoiding the mirror, covering it with a heavy sheet. But the dread was inescapable. Even with the mirror covered, I felt its presence. The shadows in my apartment seemed darker, more oppressive. I could feel an invisible weight pressing down on me. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint whispering. It was as though someone was murmuring from the direction of the mirror. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up and strained to hear. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't quite understand, but the tone was unmistakably malevolent. It felt as if the mirror was beckoning me to look. Despite my fear, I pulled the sheet off the mirror. The reflection was different this time. Instead of my usual bedroom, I saw a dark, chaotic room. In the reflection, I was there. My face twisted in agony, the shadowy figure looming closer. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its presence seemed to reach out of the mirror, extending into my world. I recoiled, stumbling back in terror. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I had seen, but the fear was all-consuming. I knew that the mirror wasn't just reflecting my fears. It was amplifying them, turning my own nightmares into a tangible reality. I began to feel like I was losing control. The mirror's curse seemed to seep into every aspect of my life. I stopped sleeping, haunted by the dark visions that the mirror presented. I sought help from therapists and spiritualists, but no one could explain the mirror's malevolent power. My life became a series of sleepless nights and haunting visions. I avoided the mirror as much as possible, but it was impossible to escape the fear that had taken root in my soul. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to move and shift. Every creak of the floorboards felt like the approach of the shadowy figure. One particularly harrowing night, as I lay in bed, the whispers from the mirror grew louder, more insistent. The figure in the reflection seemed to move, its form becoming clearer and more menacing. It felt as though it was trying to reach out to me, to pull me into the mirror's dark domain. Desperate to break free from the curse, I decided to confront the mirror directly. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox, my hands trembling as I approached the bedroom. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple as I raised the hammer, as though aware of my intention. With a cry of determination, I swung the hammer at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, the shards scattering across the floor. I felt a fleeting sense of relief, believing that the curse had been broken. But as the dust settled, I saw something even more horrifying in the reflection of the broken mirror. A vision of myself, not as I was, but as I would become. My face was gaunt and hollow, etched with lines of worry and despair. The shadowy figure loomed behind me, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It was a vision of a future consumed by fear and darkness. Even after destroying the mirror, the curse seemed to linger. I moved out of my apartment, hoping a change of scenery would help me escape the shadows that haunted me. But no matter where I went, the dark presence followed. It was as though the mirror had imprinted itself on my soul, leaving a permanent scar. I sought out every possible solution: exorcisms, spiritual cleansings, therapy. But nothing seemed to work. The visions continued, and the shadowy figure remained a constant presence in my nightmares and waking hours. It felt like the curse had become a part of me, a dark stain on my very being. One night, while staying at a friend's house, I was unable to sleep. I wandered through their home, my mind racing with thoughts of the mirror and its curse. I found myself in front of a large window, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the reflection, a dark shape that seemed to follow me wherever I went. My fear escalated to a point where I could no longer distinguish between reality and the visions created by the mirror. I was on the brink of madness, consumed by the darkness that had taken over my life. Desperate and exhausted, I decided to return to the place where it all began, the old antique shop. When I arrived, the shop was gone. The building was abandoned, as if it had never existed. The sense of loss and frustration overwhelmed me. I had no idea where to turn next. As I wandered through the empty streets, I encountered a strange figure, a woman who looked almost as old as the shopkeeper I had met before. She seemed to materialize out of nowhere, her eyes filled with a deep, knowing sadness. "You've come to seek answers," she said softly. "The mirror's curse is not something that can be easily broken. It is a reflection of your own fears and darkness." I stared at her, my heart pounding. How do I end this? How do I escape the curse? She looked at me with a mixture of pity and understanding. The curse can only be lifted by confronting the darkness within yourself. The mirror was merely a catalyst, a way for you to see what you refuse to acknowledge. You must face your fears, not just the mirror's shadow, but the shadows within your own soul. Her words resonated with me, but I didn't know how to confront my own fears. I returned to my apartment, the darkness still lurking in every corner. I knew that the mirror's curse had forced me to confront not just external fears, but the internal darkness that had been hiding within me. I began to reflect on my life, the choices I had made, and the fears that had shaped my existence. It was a painful process, facing the parts of myself I had tried to ignore. The mirror had shown me not just my future, but the darkness that I had been running from all along. With each passing day, I tried to confront these fears, to accept and embrace them. It was a slow, arduous process, but I began to feel a sense of relief, as though the darkness that had once consumed me was slowly being acknowledged and understood. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch glimpses of shadows and reflections, fleeting images of a dark figure lurking just out of sight. The mirror's curse may have been a reflection of my own fears, but it left an indelible mark on my soul. I am Claire, and my life was forever altered by the mirror's curse. It taught me that some reflections are too dark to confront, and that the shadows we see are often a part of us, waiting to be faced. Though the mirror is gone, its curse lives on within me, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our lives. And so, I continue to live with the haunting realization that the mirror's curse was not just a test of my fear, but a journey into the darkest corners of my own soul. I've been trucking for over 20 years. You'd think I'd seen it all by now, but there are some jobs that stick with you. Ones that make you question everything you thought you knew about the road. This job started like any other. I was running a late-night haul, heading from Salt Lake City down to Colorado. Simple, straightforward. But then, my dispatcher called with a detour. We got a special pickup near Green River. No questions, just drop it at the designated address. Pays triple. Triple pay for a detour? It was too good to pass up. I arrived at the pickup location a little after midnight, down a dirt road that cut through miles of barren desert. There wasn't a soul in sight, just an old storage facility with faded signs and flickering lights. No one was there to meet me, but the gate was open, and a lone shipping container sat by itself in the lot, painted a dull, rusted gray. The paperwork was in order, though. Instructions were simple: pick up, drive, and deliver. But there was something off about the cargo. It wasn't the size, just a standard 40-foot container. It was the weight. The paperwork said the load was a couple thousand pounds, but when I hitched it to the rig, the truck groaned like it was carrying double that. Whatever. I wasn't paid to ask questions, just to haul the load. I locked it up, checked the chains, and hit the road. That's when the weirdness started. It was just past 1 a.m., and I was cruising down the highway. The night was still, the stars flickering against the vast emptiness of the desert. But something about the cargo weighed on me. Not just its physical weight, but a sense of dread that crept up the back of my neck. About an hour into the drive, I heard a thump. At first, I thought it was just the trailer settling. Cargo shifts, especially if it's not secured perfectly. But then it happened again, louder. Thump, thump. It was rhythmic, almost like knocking. I turned the radio down, straining to listen. The noise seemed to be coming from the container. It grew louder with each passing mile. Thump, thump. I pulled off to the side of the road, threw the truck in park, and climbed out. The desert was eerily silent, the cool night air prickling my skin. I walked around to the back of the trailer and checked the locks. Everything was sealed tight, just like I left it. The thumping had stopped. I leaned in, ear against the cold metal of the container. Nothing. With a shake of my head, I climbed back into the truck, chalking it up to nerves or exhaustion. I'd been driving for hours, and fatigue plays tricks on your mind. I was back on the road, but something was gnawing at me. The GPS was acting up, the screen flickering between maps and static. The signal was weak out here, but I'd driven through worse. I knew the way. I didn't need technology to tell me. The thumping started again. Louder this time. It sounded more deliberate, more insistent, like someone, or something, was inside the container, trying to get out. I picked up the pace, telling myself it was just cargo shifting, nothing to worry about. But no matter how fast I drove, the sound followed me, growing more frantic. Thump, thump, thump. Then I saw something in the mirror, a shadow in the back of the cab. I nearly swerved off the road. I jerked the wheel, righting the truck, and snapped my head back to look again. The shadow was gone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe it was the stress of the weird job getting to me. But deep down, I knew better. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the truck itself was suffocating under the weight of whatever was in that container. I didn't stop driving, not for anything, but the temperature in the cab seemed to drop, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. Then I saw it again. This time, not in the mirror, but in the passenger seat. A figure cloaked in darkness, barely visible. I could only make out its shape, a human-like form, hunched, staring straight ahead. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. My blood ran cold. I slammed the brakes, heart pounding in my chest. The figure vanished as soon as I looked directly at it, like it was never there. I was starting to lose it. Exhaustion, stress. It had to be messing with my head. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. I needed to know what was inside that container. I couldn't take the guessing, the creeping dread any longer. I pulled off onto a desolate side road, gravel crunching under my tires. I stepped out into the cold night, my breath visible in the air, despite it being summer. The container loomed behind me, silent and still, yet I could feel its presence, like something malevolent was just on the other side of that steel door. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the padlock and swung the doors open. Darkness. The container was pitch black inside, the light from the truck barely reaching in. I grabbed a flashlight from the cab and shone it into the container, expecting to see crates or heavy machinery, something that explained the weight. But there was nothing. The container was completely empty. I stood there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of it. There was no way the load could be this heavy with nothing inside. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam sweeping across the empty steel walls, and that's when I saw it. Scratches, long deep gouges etched into the metal, like something had been clawing to get out. My heart raced as I traced them with the light, and that's when the smell hit me. An overpowering stench of decay, like something had been rotting in there for weeks. I backed away, ready to shut the doors and leave this job behind. But before I could move, the thumping returned. This time, it wasn't from the container. It was coming from inside the cab of my truck. Panic surged through me as I slammed the container doors shut, locking them as fast as I could. I turned back to the truck, my heart pounding in my ears. The thumping was louder now, more frantic, like something or someone was trying to break out of the cab itself. I hesitated, not wanting to get any closer, but I had to. My keys, my only way out, were inside. I crept toward the truck, flashlight trembling in my hand. The windows were fogged over, the interior obscured. I reached for the door, hand shaking as I gripped the handle. Slowly, I pulled it open. The cab was empty. No sign of anyone, or anything. But the smell was there, that same stench of decay, stronger now. It filled the cab, suffocating me. I grabbed the keys, threw myself into the seat and started the engine, my mind screaming at me to get the hell out of there. As I drove, the GPS flickered back to life, directing me back onto the highway. I didn't care where it led me, as long as it was far away from whatever I had just encountered. The road stretched on into the night, and I kept driving, refusing to look back. But even as I sped down the highway, the weight in the back felt heavier. The truck groaned under the strain, and I knew, whatever I'd let loose, it wasn't staying behind. And now, it was coming with me. I never made that delivery. I don't know what was inside that container, and I don't want to know. All I know is that some loads, you're not meant to carry.